White store owner woman sees a black teen and calls the cops. No questions, no crime, just suspicion. But the moment Big Shaq shows up, the story flips. This isn't just about a call, it's about what that call reveals. Because when power walks in wearing truth, the whole town learns. You don't mess with a father who built his life dodging the very system, now aimed at his son. Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel, and tell us where are you watching from. Share in the comments below. The morning air felt clean. The kind that drifted in through half-cracked windows, warm and lazy. It was a Tuesday in Crestwood Pines, one of those suburbs outside Orlando where mailboxes wore American flags, and golden retrievers lounged like sentries on front porches. The sun draped itself on the neighborhood like a memory you didn't realize you missed. From the outside looking in, Crestwood was what people called nice. Not perfect, nothing ever is, but safe, orderly, familiar. The kind of place where lawns stayed mowed, and kids rode bikes in straight lines. That's where we start, right in the middle of this postcard. Big Shaq had lived here for almost 6 years now. He'd bought the house quietly, no press release, no social media flex, just a contract signed, a gate installed, and a conscious decision to step away, not from the world, but from the part of it that always had a camera pointed in his face. Retirement was louder for some, but for Shaq it was this: Sunday barbecues, fixing sprinklers himself, learning how to make grilled salmon the way Lucille used to. This neighborhood had no clue how many trophies were boxed up in his garage, under old Christmas lights and toolkits. He liked it that way. He lived there with his son, Jalen, 15 years old, and growing too fast. The kid was thoughtful, observant, and carried himself like he had something to prove, but never said it out loud. He was the type who'd take an extra 5 seconds to hold the door open for someone walking slow, or stop mid-bike ride to untangle a bird's nest of fishing line from a tree branch. There was a calm in him, the kind that came from being raised by someone who knew how loud the world could be, and how dangerous it was when it decided not to listen. That morning started like any other. Shaq was in the backyard fixing the net Jalen had accidentally snapped in half during one of his "let me show you this" dunk stunts. The broken rim lay on the grass, mocking him like an old rival. Inside, the smell of scrambled eggs and cinnamon toast crept out from the kitchen. Lucille's recipes, always the foundation. Jalen was upstairs getting dressed, headphones in, humming something soft but upbeat. No one knew yet that this would be the day everything tilted. Crestwood Pines wasn't used to tilting. The neighborhood ran on rhythms. Lawnmowers at 9, UPS trucks at noon, sprinklers at 6. Every face had its place. Mr. DeWitt across the street always walked his beagle in a Hawaiian shirt. Miss Elena trimmed her rose bushes in a pink visor, her fingers calloused from years of careful pruning. The kids down the block chalked peace signs and hopscotch grids on the sidewalk like they were signing their own little treaties. Shaq liked that rhythm. It meant no surprises. It meant he could finally be just another dad yelling at a ladder that refused to stay up straight. He'd even gotten used to Cynthia Griggs's sharp glances whenever he passed her hardware store. She ran the only locally owned shop in town, an old 2-story building with peeling red paint and a hand-painted sign that hadn't changed since the early 90s. Cynthia stood tall behind that counter, shoulders stiff, voice clipped. She didn't smile much. Shaq had seen the way she watched him, eyes like a ruler, always measuring. He didn't take it personal, not at first. Jalen asked that morning if he could go pick up a new net by himself. "You sure?" Shaq had asked, wiping his hands on a towel. "I can go with you in 20. But the kid grinned, shook his head. "I got it, Dad. I'll be back in 25 tops." It felt like a good moment. Trust. Independence. A Tuesday lesson in growing up. So Shaq let him go. The walk to Griggs's hardware wasn't far. 6 blocks through neat sidewalks, past the park with the busted swing, down the little street where kids painted rocks and left them like hidden treasure under trees. Jalen walked easy, earbuds in, receipt in hand. He'd called ahead, knew they had the net in stock. The sun hung low behind the clouds, and everything felt exactly how it should. But the thing about normal days is when they break like glass. Silent first, then sudden. What no one saw was Cynthia behind the counter, watching Jalen walk in. What no one heard was the pause in her breath when she saw the color of his skin before she saw the receipt. She greeted him flatly, her smile stiff as week-old bread. He showed her the code, pointed to the shelf where the nets were displayed. She didn't answer. Instead, she stepped into the back and didn't come out for 4 minutes. When she did, the phone in her hand wasn't to restock or check inventory. It was to dial the sheriff's department. She told them a suspicious teenager had come in. No specifics, no mention of his receipt, just a tight, vague alarm. The kind that sends the wrong message to the right ears. At that moment, something unseen began to vibrate beneath Crestwood Pines. A crack in the rhythm. An imbalance. Back at the house, Shaq stood under the hoop, attaching the metal ring to the backboard, oblivious. He had a soft whistle going. Something old school, maybe Curtis Mayfield. The kind of tune that made even problems seem like they could be managed. The phone on the patio table lit up once. Buzzed. Then again. Then stayed still. He didn't check it right away. He liked finishing things first. The smell of morning was starting to fade. Heat was crawling across the sky now, and in the distance at the intersection of comfort and suspicion, a teenager stood still in a store, heart pounding, wondering why his question had gone unanswered, and why 2 sheriff cruisers had just pulled up outside. Crestwood Pines didn't know it yet, but today wouldn't end like it started. Because the boy in aisle 3 wasn't just any boy. And the man with the broken net in his hand wasn't just any man. And the story about to unfold, it would shake loose every layer they thought was safe, even the ones they'd sworn were long buried. Jalen walked with the kind of ease that belonged to someone who had never expected the world to tip beneath him. In one pocket, a folded receipt with a scribbled skew and the word net underlined twice. In the other, a neatly counted $65 from last week's lawn mowing gigs. 3 houses, 2 front yards, 1 stubborn oak that dropped more leaves than seemed scientifically possible. His headphones played something mellow, a jazz remix that kept him in rhythm with the breeze. It was all just part of a plan. In and out. He'd walk to Griggs's Hardware, grab the net his dad liked, come home, and have it up before Shaq even noticed. That was the idea. Simple, predictable, good. The bell above the door jingled like an afterthought when he stepped inside. It was one of those small-town sounds that meant little, until the moment you wished it hadn't happened. The store smelled like old wood, oil rags, and sun-warmed paint cans. Shelves stretched tight with worn inventory. Nothing flashy, nothing modern, just hammers, brushes, ropes, screws. And near the back, past the hanging light bulbs and garden gloves, the narrow aisle where the basketball nets waited, looped like tangled dreams in plastic packaging. Behind the counter stood Cynthia Griggs. She didn't look up right away. She was hunched over an order sheet, pen tapping, lips pressed in a line. The air inside felt still, too still for the time of day. Jalen offered a small "hey there," but she barely glanced at him, a flick of her eyes, that measuring kind. Not the curious kind you offer strangers, but the kind that sorts, scans, categorizes. He recognized it, even if he didn't want to. It wasn't new. He walked calmly to the back, the receipt in his hand like a flag no one wanted to see. He found the net in 2 minutes. Red packaging, woven nylon, just like the online listing. Still holding his earbuds in one hand, he made his way back to the front counter and stood there quietly, respectful, like his father taught him. Cynthia didn't say anything, just looked at the net, then at him, then at the cash in his hand. Something tightened in her expression, something silent and dangerous. "You say you called ahead?" she asked finally, voice clipped like scissors. Jalen nodded. "Yes, ma'am. Yesterday afternoon, I spoke with a man. He said it'd be in stock." She didn't blink. She looked down at the register, then back at him, eyes lingering too long. "You sure it wasn't someone else you talked to? We don't usually hold items for walk-ins." "I didn't ask you to hold it," Jalen said, still trying to keep his voice steady. "Just wanted to make sure you had it." He unfolded the receipt and laid it gently on the counter. His handwriting was neat, block letters printed with care. Cynthia didn't touch it. She stared at it like it might vanish if she waited long enough. "I'll be right back," she muttered, and disappeared through the door behind the counter, leaving Jalen standing there, the net in one hand, his fingers brushing the plastic like it might give him answers. 2 minutes passed, then 4. The silence pressed in. The jazz from his earbuds had stopped. His phone buzzed once in his pocket. He didn't check it. The longer he stood, the more he felt it, that crawling unease, like standing too long in someone else's shadow. In the back room, Cynthia's voice was low, hushed, tense. She wasn't checking inventory. She was on the phone. Jalen didn't hear what she said, but he saw the edge of it in her posture when she returned. Her eyes wouldn't meet his. Her hands moved too quickly, placing the receipt to the side, fiddling with a pen that didn't need to be moved. "Sorry about that," she said too casually, "just checking something." He nodded, unsure. "Can I pay now?" She didn't answer. Instead, she looked out the front window, like she was waiting for someone. And then, as if on cue, a flicker of red and blue lights danced off the edge of the counter. Not flashing, not urgent, just there, present, settling. Jalen turned. Two sheriff cars parked across the street. Engines still running. Deputies stepping out slow, measured, no rush, no alarm, but every step heavy with purpose. One of them placed a hand on his belt, right above the holster. Not drawing, just reminding. "Excuse me," Jalen said quietly, turning back to Cynthia. "Why are the police here?" She didn't answer. Her lips pressed tighter. Her fingers twitched near the receipt. The door opened behind him, the bell ringing again, cheerful and out of place. The two deputies walked in. One older, mustached, mid-50s maybe. The other younger, buzz-cut, face unreadable. The older one spoke first. "Ma'am." He nodded at Cynthia. "You the one who called in?" She gave a slight nod, barely moving. "Just wanted to be safe," she said, voice low. Didn't recognize the boy. He was acting uncertain. Jalen felt his stomach twist. "Uncertain?" he repeated. "I walked in, asked for what I needed, and waited." The younger deputy stepped forward. "Mind if we talk outside?" "I didn't do anything," Jalen said, the edge creeping into his voice. "I didn't even touch anything but this net, and my phone." "We understand. Just need to sort things out," the older one replied, calm but firm. "Standard." He looked at Cynthia, searching for something in her eyes. An explanation, an apology, even a flinch. But she stared right past him, already straightening the counter, as if this part of the day had played out 100 times in her head. Outside, the heat was rising. Jalen stepped into the sun, his back burning not from the rays, but from the eyes that always came with flashing lights. Neighbors across the street peeked out behind their curtains, a couple slowing their jog to glance. No one said anything, just what? The questions were soft, but loaded. "Why were you at the store? Do you know the owner? Have you ever been here before?" Each answer came clean, but each response was met with that same look. The kind that didn't believe you were the person you claimed to be. 10 minutes later, they let him go. No charges, no citations. Just a polite nod and a "have a nice day" that didn't mean a thing. He didn't take the net. He didn't take the receipt. He just walked back down the sidewalk, headphones in, music off. Back at the store, Cynthia locked the door, then opened it again, and flipped the sign to closed. Her hand shook slightly, but not from fear, from something deeper, something unsettled. In his pocket, Jalen's phone buzzed again. A new message from his dad. "Everything good?" He didn't respond right away. He just kept walking, past the painted rocks, past the park, past the peace signs on the pavement that didn't feel like they applied to him today. Back at home, the rim sat half installed, bolts shining like unfinished promises. The sky above was still blue, still sunny, but the air had changed. Because sometimes all it takes is one moment, one assumption, one ordinary trip, for the world to start cracking at the edges. The call came at 11:46 a.m., just as Shaq was stepping down from the ladder, wiping the sweat from his forehead with the hem of his old Diesel Don't Fold t-shirt. The rim was finally level again. Jalen would be proud. It wasn't perfect, but it would hold. That was the thing about Shaq. He didn't just fix what was broken. He made it last. But the moment the phone buzzed in his pocket, that quiet sense of completion crumbled. 3 vibrations, 1 caller ID, Orange County Sheriff Dept. No one ever saved that number, unless they had a reason to. He stared at it for a beat too long. Time. Suddenly thick. Then he picked up. "Hello?" A pause. Then a voice he hadn't heard in a long time, one that came with its own weight. Deputy Rollins. Drawl still intact. Tone clipped like someone trying not to sound like they were enjoying themselves too much. "Shaquille, this is Deputy Rollins. Got your boy here at Griggs's Hardware. Nothing major. Just a little confusion. Thought you might want to come down and clear things up." The silence on Shaq's end was immediate. Sharp. Then came the voice beneath the voice. Not Rollins. Jalen's. Faint in the background. Shaky but controlled. "I didn't do anything, Dad. I swear. That was all he said before the line clicked. Call ended. Shaq didn't move for a second. The phone stayed pressed to his ear, screen dark, as if it might whisper something else, if he waited. But there was nothing. No follow-up. No explanation. Just a flat line, and the echo of his son's voice. Hollow in his head. He looked down at his hands, grease still under the nails, one finger bleeding from the bolt he'd stripped open. That rim had taken him 20 minutes. Jalen had been gone for 40. He grabbed his keys from the hook by the kitchen door. Didn't even switch off the stove where water had been boiling for tea. The air inside the car felt 10 degrees hotter than outside. As he pulled out of the driveway, the neighborhood blurred around him, not the trees or houses. Those were still there. But the idea of safety, the illusion. Shaq didn't drive fast. Fast driving meant panic, and panic meant loss of control. But his grip on the wheel was tight. Not rage. Not yet. Something deeper. Something quieter. The kind of dread only fathers know. He knew Rollins. Had known him for years. Back when Shaq bought the house in Crestwood Pines, Rollins was one of the first officers to knock on his door. Not to welcome him, just to introduce himself. Just in case. Shaq had clocked it then. The badge, the tone, the subtle way he looked over Shaq's shoulder, scanning the inside of the home like it didn't quite match the man who lived in it. They'd crossed paths. Since then, a few block events, a few reports of suspicious cars that turned out to be his friends or Jalen's coaches. Rollins was always professional, but never neutral. And Shaq, for all his size and fame, had learned long ago that there was a kind of law that didn't wear its bias out loud. It just waited for the right moment to flex it. He pulled into the parking lot of Griggs's Hardware and saw them immediately. Two cruisers. One officer leaning against the driver's side door like he had time. Jalen sitting on the curb, arms crossed over his knees, head down. Shaq parked slow, deliberate. As he stepped out, he noticed Cynthia inside the store, watching from the window, pretending not to watch, the way people do when they've lit a fire and want to see how fast it spreads. Rollins approached before Shaq made it 3 steps. Appreciate you coming down. Just a little misunderstanding. Really. Mrs. Griggs called in. Said your son was acting nervous. Didn't have ID. Said she didn't recognize him. Shaq stared at him. Flat. Quiet. No greeting. No nod. My son, Shaq said, is 15. He doesn't need ID to buy a basketball net. Rollins gave a shrug that pretended to be understanding, but wasn't. I get it. I do. But you know how people get jittery these days. She didn't know who he was. We have to respond when called. Shaq took a step closer. Not threatening. Just present. And when you got here, did you see the cash in his hand? The receipt? Did you ask her why she didn't sell it to him but decided to call 2 patrol cars instead? Rollins hesitated. Just a flicker. I'm not here to play judge. Just to make sure things stay calm. Shaq leaned in slightly. You remember the last time we met like this, Rollins? Back when you pulled me over outside my own house at night. Said the taillight was out. It wasn't. Rollins' jaw tightened, but he didn't bite. We're not here to rehash old misunderstandings. Shaquille, you called it a misunderstanding then too. The deputy said nothing. Shaq walked past him, toward Jalen, who hadn't moved. The boy looked up just as Shaq crouched beside him. His eyes were dry, but his jaw was locked, fists tight. That kind of stillness didn't come from fear. It came from humiliation. You okay? Shaq asked, low. Jalen nodded. She didn't even look at the receipt. Just went to the back. Next thing I know, they're pulling up. Shaq took a deep breath, then stood and faced the store. Cynthia was no longer at the window. The open sign had flipped. Cowardice in motion. He turned back to Rollins. We done here? Rollins gave a tight nod. We're done. No citation. No paperwork. Just another file in the cabinet of moments that black fathers carry. Filed under could have been worse. As they walked back to the car, Jalen finally spoke. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't do anything, Dad. Shaq didn't answer right away. He just unlocked the door and let Jalen slide in. When he sat behind the wheel, hands gripping the leather a little too hard, he glanced at his son and said, I know. But what he didn't say, what hung between them like steam on the windshield, was that doing nothing had never really been enough. Back home, the net was still on the table, untouched. Shaq looked at it for a long moment. Not the material, not the packaging, But what it represented now, a routine turned rupture, a Tuesday turned lesson, a father turned witness. He picked it up slowly and placed it in the trash. Some things just weren't worth keeping anymore. It wasn't the first time. That's what kept circling Shaq's mind as he stood at the edge of his backyard, watching Jalen pace quietly across the concrete like his thoughts needed more space than the world would ever give him. This moment his son accused, examined, dismissed, wasn't some isolated storm that blew in from nowhere. It was a pattern, a cycle dressed up differently each time but still shaped from the same mold. Shaq had known that mold, knew it too well. Before he was Big Diesel, before the arenas, before the cameras, before the name meant anything to anyone outside of a modest brown house in Newark, New Jersey, there had been a boy who walked into a corner store and came out with a weight no child should carry. He was 11, maybe 12. His mom Lucille had asked him to pick up bread and toothpaste after school. He still remembered the sky that day, gray but not heavy, like it was watching. The store sat on the corner of South Orange Avenue and Grove Street, narrow and dimly lit. The bell above the door clanged when you opened it, and the floor creaked like it was older than the building itself. Shaq had walked in with his usual stride, quiet, polite. He knew the owner's face, but the man never used his name. There was a comic book stand near the front, wedged between the freezer and the spinning rack of sunglasses. No one ever bought. On that day, Shaq's eye caught a glossy cover, a new issue of Steel Guardian, the one where the hero finally unmasks the mayor as the villain. He wasn't planning to buy it. Lucille's list was strict, but he picked it up, just for a moment, just to glance. That was the exact moment the store owner turned the corner and froze. "What do you think you're doing?" Shaq blinked, held up the comic. "Just looking." "You're not just looking." The man's voice dropped into something sharper, something colder. "Put that down and step away from the stand." Shaq did, slowly, carefully, as if the pages were wired with suspicion. "You put something in your jacket?" "No, sir." "You sure?" Shaq opened his jacket, turned his pockets inside out. Nothing. But it didn't matter. The man stepped to the phone, started dialing. "We'll let the cops sort it out." The next 10 minutes felt like a vacuum. Shaq remembered the fluorescent lights humming overhead, the plastic bags fluttering near the register like nervous hands. He stood near the freezer, too scared to cry, too proud to look away. The officer who arrived was young, tired-looking, and barely glanced at Shaq before sighing. After a tense pat-down, he told the owner nothing was missing. Kids clean. No apology, no handshake, just a grunt from the owner, and the echo of the door closing behind Shaq as he stepped back into the cold. The bread and toothpaste forgot. When he got home, Lucille didn't say "I told you so." She didn't raise her voice or ask him to repeat the story. She sat him down, made tea even though he didn't like it, and said, "There are mirrors in this country that don't reflect you. They distort you. They'll make you think your shadow's bigger than your heart. You understand?" He didn't. Not fully. Not then. But the line stayed in him like a root. "You walk into a room, baby," she continued, "and half of it will already have decided who you are. Your job is to stay whole when they try to slice you into something smaller." Years later, when he was drafted and reporters swarmed like bees around his locker, asking about muscles and fame, and shoes, Shaq would still hear her voice. He'd smile, crack jokes, be the gentle giant, America's big brother. But beneath it all was the memory of a comic book and a silence that weighed more than it should have. Now watching Jalen drag his sneakers across the court in their backyard, Shaq felt that same silence creeping back. This was what legacies sometimes looked like, not trophies or gold-plated plaques, but inherited wounds, passed like heirlooms, without ever meaning to. Jalen hadn't cried, he hadn't yelled, but Shaq could see it how he'd held the shame like it was a mistake he had made, even though it was never his. Later that evening, as the sky turned to watercolor, Shaq sat with Lucille on the porch. She'd come by unannounced, her way of saying "I know" without saying it. She held her tea like a compass, always pointing toward the truth. "He told me he was fine," Shaq said, "but he ain't. He thinks he did something wrong just by existing in that store." Lucille nodded slow. "That's how they get you to stay small." Shaq looked out toward the fading light. "I thought moving here would help. Quiet streets, good schools, clean air. But it's like no matter where we go, they follow us with their own story already written." Lucille didn't respond right away. Then she said, "A story doesn't hurt if you know it's fiction. The problem is when our boys start believing it's true." That line sat heavy. Shaq thought about the weight of his own name. How it had once been a shield. Fame, reputation, likability. People said Big Shaq and smiled. They thought of dance battles, halftime antics, goofy commercials. They didn't see the boy who'd been stopped, questioned, doubted, long before the world started cheering. But Jalen didn't have that shield yet. All he had was a last name, and a truth no one wanted to admit, that being black, being young, and being alone was often enough to justify suspicion in the eyes of people like Cynthia Griggs. That night, Jalen finally came inside, silent but not cold. He sat at the kitchen table, chewing slowly, not making eye contact. Shaq waited until they were alone, the clatter of dishes fading in the sink. Then he said, "You did everything right today. You hear me?" Jalen nodded, not looking up. "You carried yourself with respect. You stayed calm. You told the truth." Another nod.
"I'm proud of you."
"Not just because you're my son, but because you stayed whole when they tried to shrink you." Jalen looked up then, eyes glossy but strong. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. In that silence, something passed between them. Not an ending, not a solution, but a recognition. This wasn't the last time the mirrors would distort them. But now, at least, they saw them for what they were. And that made all the difference. The automatic door slid open with a lazy hiss, but its sound cut through the room like a blade. Shaq stepped into Griggs's hardware, with the kind of gravity that bent the air. No words, no wide stance, no showmanship, just that quiet, undeniable presence that needed no introduction. The store, old and dim-lit, shrank under the weight of him. Every shelf, every loose nail jar, every sagging rack suddenly felt like it was holding its breath. Cynthia Griggs was behind the counter, back stiff, hands twitching near the receipt printer. Her eyes lifted slowly, like they didn't want to see what they already knew. And then she saw him. Not the Shaquille O'Neal from the billboards, or the analyst laughing courtside. Not Big Shaq, the meme or the mascot. What stood in front of her now was a father who had already been summoned by the sirens of assumption. And she flinched, not at the size of him, but at what he stood for. Shaq didn't look at her first. He looked at his son. Jalen stood to the side, near the net he had tried to buy. His shoulders were square, his face still, but his eyes, they trembled. He hadn't moved since the officers had let him back inside. One stood behind him now, Officer Kinley, the younger of the two who had arrived earlier. His arms were crossed, and his eyes kept flicking between Shaq and Cynthia like he didn't want to be part of this, but also didn't want to miss it. The second deputy, Rollins, had stepped outside, likely to make a call or to give himself a moment away from what he suspected was about to unfold. Shaq walked forward, slow, his footsteps echoing on the linoleum. He passed a row of rakes and bags of soil. The net in its packaging was still resting on the counter where Jalen had placed it, untouched, like a truth no one wanted to hold. Shaq stopped just short of the counter, not leaning in, not towering over, but still larger than anything in the room. Cynthia opened her mouth, closed it, tried again. "Mr. O'Neal," she said, her voice brittle. There's been a misunderstanding." Shaq didn't blink. "I'm listening." Cynthia's throat moved like she had swallowed sand. "I didn't know he was your son." That was it. That one sentence. Shaq exhaled, slow and long. He looked past her, past the walls, like something in him had just solidified. "You didn't need to know who he belonged to," he said quietly. "You only needed to see him as someone who walked in to buy something. With money, with a receipt, with respect." Her eyes shifted, fast. He was acting nervous. He kept fidgeting. Shaq tilted his head. "He's 15, in a store, alone, and black. What do you expect?" Cynthia's lips pressed together. I've had trouble before. The neighborhood isn't the same. People come in, take things. We can't afford." "You didn't see a threat," Shaq interrupted, his voice still calm, but carrying. "You looked for one. You created one. Out of a kid. My kid." There was silence then. Not the awkward kind. The loaded kind. The kind that makes rooms feel smaller, and truths grow teeth. Kinley shifted, as if to say something, then didn't. Shaq's eyes finally flicked toward him. "Is there something you need to say, officer?" Kinley shook his head. "No, sir. Everything's clear now." Shaq turned back to Cynthia, and this time, he didn't speak. He just looked, and Cynthia looked away, unable to meet the full stare of a man who had worked his whole life to be bigger than the box people tried to keep him in. only to find his son being shoved into it. Anyway. Then it happened. A flicker. A tremble of recognition. Not from this moment. From something older. Shaq narrowed his eyes. We've met before. It wasn't a question. It was a fact. Unspoken until now. Cynthia's hand froze mid-gesture. Her mouth parted, but she didn't speak. I couldn't place it. Until now. He continued. But I remember your husband, Raymond Griggs. He tried to block the community rec center project in West Longwood. Said it would bring in the wrong crowd. That was 10 years ago. You were at the town hearing. Sat in the third row. Argued that the basketball courts would attract noise. Cynthia's face lost all color. Shaq leaned in just slightly. Voice low. You didn't just see my son as a stranger. You saw him as my son. And that was enough. Cynthia shook her head. Breath shallow. That's not true. Shaq straightened. No? Then why call the cops before asking a single question? Why not let him speak? He had the receipt in his hand. You ignored it. Her eyes darted again. I didn't think. You did think. Shaq cut in. This time firmer. You thought he didn't belong here. And you used fear as your defense. Just like your husband did when we tried to build something better. The store was silent again. Kinley was shifting uncomfortably now, glancing at the door as if wishing Rollins would walk back in and give him an exit. But Shaq was unmoved. He looked at Jalen, nodded once, then stepped toward the counter. He picked up the net. The price tag still dangled from it like it had been waiting for someone with the right face to claim it. He placed $65 in cash on the counter just as Jalen had hours earlier. Then he looked back at Cynthia, voice cool. You're going to give my son his change, and you're going to look him in the eye when you do. Cynthia's hand trembled as she opened the register. The sound of the drawer sliding out cracked through the quiet. She counted slowly. Gave Jalen his change. He didn't say anything. He didn't have to. But his fingers took the bills with steady dignity. Shaq turned to leave, and Jalen followed. But just before stepping out, Shaq paused. No theatrics. Just presence. You thought calling the police would protect your store, he said without turning around. What you don't realize is it exposed your fear to the whole town. And fear like that, it doesn't stay hidden for long. Then they walked out. Together. No sirens. No handcuffs. Just a silence louder than any verdict. And behind them, the store sat quieter than it ever had, like it finally understood what it had become. The door had closed behind them, but the echoes stayed. As Shaq and Jalen walked back to the car, silence held between them, not the kind that stretched with discomfort, but the kind thickened by recognition. Not everything that had happened in that store was about misunderstanding or fear. Not everything was about race. Not just, there had been something deeper behind Cynthia Griggs's eyes. A knowing. A weight. It hadn't just been suspicion. It had been something old. Personal. Shaq sat in the car for a few minutes before starting the engine. Jalen looked out the window, one hand resting on the basketball net like it was more than just equipment now. Like it was evidence. Shaq didn't start the car right away. He stared at the faded open sign through the glass of the hardware store, then into the distance past the parking lot, past the years. A memory began to pull itself up from where he'd buried it. Raymond Griggs. The name had surfaced too easily back in the store. And now it wouldn't leave him alone. 10 years ago, when Shaq had invested in building a youth rec center in West Longwood, a neglected pocket of the city ignored by city planners and prioritized only when elections rolled around, Ray Griggs had been the man who stood at the council podium to stop him. Griggs wore a flag pin on his collar, and the look of a man who'd inherited his beliefs instead of examining them. His words were careful then, but not clean. He talked about preserving neighborhood character, about traffic influx, about misplaced funding. But Shaq heard what he was really saying. He wasn't scared of kids playing basketball. He was scared of the ones who didn't look like his. Ray had organized a petition, filed an injunction, tried to block permits with legal tactics that slowed everything down. He even pushed for a noise ordinance so tight that kids wouldn't have been allowed to bounce a ball after 6 p.m. But what set him apart wasn't just the obstruction, it was the lawsuit. He filed a civil suit against Shaq's development group, claiming their community center would reduce property value in the surrounding area, including his own commercial real estate investments. The case never made it to trial. It was dismissed as frivolous within 2 months. But it drained time, it drained money, and it made headlines in all the wrong ways. Shaq hadn't thought of Griggs in years. Not since the man's business collapsed. He'd overextended, bought up a strip of old shops he couldn't keep, and when the rec center eventually opened, the foot traffic shifted away from his holdings. Griggs had blamed the city, he blamed the board, and quietly, bitterly, he blamed When the foreclosure notices came, the Griggs name started disappearing from city affairs, until one day, it vanished entirely. Word was, Ray had suffered a stroke, not long after losing the last of his properties. He died 2 years later. Shaq never attended the funeral. He hadn't been invited. But now he realized, Cynthia never left. She had stayed behind, running that creaky old hardware store that no one under 40 ever went into, unless they had to. And all this time she'd been watching Shaq. Not just watching, wait. Back home, Shaq pulled open the filing cabinet in his study. It was mostly filled with tax documents, architectural sketches, community proposals. But near the back, he found the thick red folder labeled Longwood Community Initiative. Leaked. Inside were the old articles, meeting minutes, a copy of the dismissal ruling, and taped to the final page, a list of opponents who had spoken at the final zoning appeal. Third from the top, Cynthia Griggs. She hadn't just stood beside her husband. She had been part of the push. Now it all made sense. The flicker in her eyes when she saw him. The stiffness. The feigned confusion about Jalen's identity. This hadn't been an act of racial profiling alone. That would have been heinous enough. But this was more calculated. It was revenge, wrapped in prejudice, dressed up as discomfort. Just enough plausible deniability to escape scrutiny. Just enough to protect her if questioned. Because who would argue with a store owner feeling unsafe? Who would accuse her of more when she could claim less? Shaq sat down heavily in the leather chair by the window. Jalen had gone to his room, music playing low. Nothing loud, just rhythm, grounding. But Shaq sat in the quiet, with the folder in his lap and the story unfolding in his mind, not like a movie but like a retraced map. Every moment from the store that day took on a new shape. Cynthia had waited for the right moment, not one she would create, but one that would arrive on its own. A black boy, alone, with no one there to confirm his name, his family, his purpose. She didn't need to orchestrate it. She just needed to be ready. And when Jalen walked in, with his father's last name, her husband's undoing stitched into it, she made her move. The cruelty wasn't in the call to the police. It was in the ease of it, the readiness, the way she'd kept that muscle trained for a decade, then used it on a child. Shaq stood up slowly and walked to Jalen's room. The door was open, the boy sitting on the edge of his bed, the net lying beside him. His eyes were focused on the floor, but when Shaq entered, he looked up. No questions, just that same alert stillness that had been following him since the incident. "I need you to hear something," Shaq said, holding up the red folder. "This isn't just about what happened to you today. It's about something that happened to me, to us." He sat beside his son and opened the folder, showing him the headlines, the articles, the meeting transcripts. Jalen read slowly, quietly. No anger, just comprehension, a puzzle being pieced together. "She knew who I was?" Jalen asked. "She knew who you were," Shaq replied. "And that made her decide you didn't belong." Jalen nodded once. Then again. He didn't cry. But his next words were soft and "So even when they know us, they still try to erase us." Shaq exhaled. "Not erase, just box us in, so they can feel bigger than what they lost." They sat in silence for a while after that, side by side. Outside, the sun had started dipping low behind the trees, casting the court in long shadows. The same court that would have been finished that day, if not for the detour. Eventually Jalen spoke again. "You think she'll try something like that with someone else?" Shaq's jaw tightened. "She doesn't have to. That store's already told everyone who she is. Now it's up to the town to decide what they're willing to tolerate." This wasn't over, but it was unmasked. And sometimes, the truth doesn't need a fight. It just needs to be seen. By sunrise the next day, the story was no longer theirs alone. It had leaked, not in loud headlines or press releases, but in backfence murmurs and subtweets that bloomed like weeds across town. By mid-morning, it was already on a local news blog, teen son of Shaquille O'Neal involved in store dispute. No details, no nuance, just enough fact to stir opinion, and just enough omission to weaponize it. By noon, the story had split the town like lightning. It wasn't just about a boy in a store anymore. It was about what people believed they saw, what they wanted to see. what they refuse to see. Crestwood Pines, a place that once wore its harmony like a badge, now hummed with tension, not explosive, not violent, just loud in quieter ways, glares that lingered too long at crosswalks, conversations that halted when Shaq stepped into a room, teachers whispering in faculty lounges, wondering what really happened. Everyone seemed to know someone who had a friend who heard the real story. But no two stories sounded the same. At the local diner, the regulars defended Cynthia with the kind of certainty that made facts irrelevant. She's been here 30 years. Always fair. My dad knew her husband. God rest his soul. One man leaned back in his booth and said, "Look, I don't care who his dad is. A kid shouldn't be that jumpy in a store unless he's hiding something." Down at the barber shop on Linden, the tone was different. They called the cops on a child with cash and a receipt. One man pulled out his phone and held up the grainy screenshot from a neighbor's Ring camera. Jalen, walking out of the store with his hands in plain sight, two deputies trailing close. You see him resisting. You see anything worth all that noise. At Jalen's school, things took a sharper turn. That afternoon, he was called into the principal's office. Shaq arrived 10 minutes later, walking in just as Jalen sat down, the assistant principal already speaking in hushed tones. Her name was Miss Eldon, and she greeted Shaq with a too-practiced smile. "This isn't punitive," she said quickly, hands folded on the desk. "But until we have more clarity, the district recommends a temporary academic leave, just to give the situation room to de-escalate." Shaq's face didn't move. "What situation?" "Well, the story has caused concern. Some parents have expressed discomfort. And frankly, there's been chatter among the students. We don't want to risk disruption." Jalen looked at the floor. Shaq looked at her like she'd just tried to hand him a knife, wrapped in a ribbon. "So you're suspending my son because adults are gossiping?" he asked, voice calm but razor thin. "It's not a suspension. It's just time away." "You think he did something wrong?" "No one's saying that." "Then why is he the one being removed?" Mrs. Alden hesitated. "Mr. O'Neill, we're trying to avoid further tension." Shaq stood slowly, the chair legs scraping just enough to make the air still. "The only tension you're avoiding is the one that holds you accountable." He placed a hand gently on Jalen's shoulder. "We'll be going now." Outside, Jalen didn't speak for several blocks. When he finally did, it was low. "So I'm guilty now? For what?" "Being seen." Shaq didn't answer right away. The car hummed beneath them, air conditioning whispering like static. Then he said, "You're not guilty. You're visible. And that scares people more than the truth." By the time they reached home, the mailbox was full, not just with letters, but with notes, some scribbled on napkins, others typed, a few anonymous. One read, "You people always make everything about race." Another said, "Thank you for finally saying something. That store's been dirty for years." Lucille called twice that evening. On the second ring, Shaq answered. "You holding up?" she asked. "Barely," he replied. "They're trying to flip it, make it like he did something. They always do. The story gets told by whoever shouts it first." Shaq exhaled. "I didn't want this to be public. It was never private. Not when the police were called. Not when the child has your name. Your story was public before you knew you had one." At dinner, Jalen picked at his food. He scrolled through his phone under the table, face flickering with the glow of comments and reposts. The video from outside the store, just a few seconds long, taken from a nearby car, had made its way onto Twitter. Shaq's son harassed in Florida store. The views climbed by the hour, and with every view came a split: support or skepticism, empathy or accusation. Shaq finally said, "Let me take your phone." Jalen hesitated, then slid it across the table. "You think it'll help?" "No. But it'll hurt less." Outside, two teenagers biked past the house and stopped at the gate. They stared for a moment, whispered something, then rode on. Shaq didn't move from the table, didn't check the cameras. He just sat in the silence of his son's confusion. Later that night, Shaq opened his laptop. He pulled up a draft of a statement he'd written, but never posted. It was meant for moments like these, the kind where you wanted to scream, but had to speak carefully instead. But he didn't post it. Not yet. Instead, he opened an email and wrote to the city council, then the school board, then the homeowners association. Each message tailored, each one measured, because truth didn't spread by accident. It had to be placed, like tiles in a mosaic, carefully and with intent. The real story wasn't just about a boy in a store. It was about who gets to define the moment, who gets to say what happened, who gets to be believed. The next morning, a printed article landed on Shaq's porch. An op-ed in the Crestwood Herald. Headline: Fear and Perception in Our Town. The byline didn't belong to Shaq. It belonged to someone unexpected. Officer Kinley.
The piece was careful, but clear.
He hadn't named names, but he described the scene, the unnecessary response, the boy with cash and a receipt, the power of assumption, the fragility of trust. Shaq read it twice, then once more. He folded it and left it on the kitchen counter for Jalen. Because in a town full of noise, sometimes the echo that mattered most was the one that came from the inside. I wasn't supposed to be a headline. I was supposed to be a surprise. That morning, when I left the house, all I wanted was to come back before Dad finished hanging the rim. I had the receipt, the model number scribbled with a Sharpie, and $65 I'd earned in the most boring ways possible. Raking leaves, picking up cans, helping Mrs. Weston find her cat. It was supposed to be simple. A loop in the day, a walk to the store, a small thing. But small things don't stay small. When you carry this skin, this frame, this name. When you're 15 and black, people don't see your intentions. They see possibilities, none of which belong to you. People say I'm lucky. They say must be nice being Shaquille O'Neal's son. Like that's some kind of shield. Like it's a vaccine against the slow rot of judgment. But I've learned something they don't say in interviews. Even Big Shaq's shadow can't cover you when someone's already decided they don't want to see you. That day in the store, I could feel it before I even picked up the net. The air shifted when I walked in. The way her eyes locked on me, like I had no right to exist in that aisle. I smiled. I spoke. I explained. But she didn't hear me. Not really. She just stared like she was watching a problem she couldn't name. I laid the receipt down gently. I didn't shove it. I didn't wave it. I set it there like proof that I belonged. She didn't even look at it. You ever stand still and feel yourself shrinking? Not because of something you did, but because someone else is building a version of you they'd rather believe. I felt that, every second she was gone in the back. Every footstep I didn't hear, I felt it. Then came the sirens. Quiet at first, like wind in the wires. Then flashing, and then two deputies walking in, like I was some kind of situation. I had cash in one hand, my phone in the other. I was standing straight. I hadn't touched a thing but that net. But none of that mattered. Because to them I wasn't Jalen O'Neal. I wasn't a son, or a student, or someone trying to buy something for his dad. I was just another echo of someone else's fear. They asked questions I've answered in my head since I was 7. Why are you here? What's in your pockets? Do you have ID? And the worst one. Are you alone? I wanted to say no. I wanted to say, my dad's voice is louder than yours. My dad's hands fixed every rim in our neighborhood. My dad would have been here already if I hadn't told him to stay home. But I just stood there. Still, safe, silent. Because I've learned that sometimes the only way to walk out is to shrink enough to fit through the eye of suspicion. They let me go, eventually. No apologies. No explanation. Just that quiet dismissal that follows kids who didn't get caught doing something they never did. When Dad showed up, everything got quiet, in a new way. Not scared quiet, not tension quiet, just still. He didn't yell. He didn't break anything. He just looked at Cynthia like she was a locked door he'd already walked through once, and wasn't interested in again. He didn't tell her I was good. He told her she never needed to question me. And I watched her wilt. Not because of who he was, but because she'd been seen, really seen. Later that night I laid on my bed staring at the ceiling, wondering how it all turned so fast. How did wanting to surprise my dad with a new net turn into people whispering about me at school? How did my name become a topic in classrooms I'd never been in? I got called to the office like I'd brought shame. But I brought a receipt. I got told to take time off for my safety. But they didn't ask how I felt. They didn't ask what I'd lost. No one asked why I was quiet. You want to know the real heartbreak? It wasn't the deputies. It wasn't Cynthia. It wasn't even the school. It was the moment I realized that all my preparation, all the talks Dad gave me, all the lessons about how to act right, how to stay calm, how to be better than their version of you, didn't change what they saw. Because I wasn't invisible. I was worse. I was imagined. They didn't look at me. They looked through me and saw a threat. I've got an honor roll certificate in my backpack. and a love for comic books, and an obsession with crossover dribbles. But none of that mattered. All they saw was a figure, a risk, a silhouette in someone else's nightmare. I didn't sleep that night. Not really. I closed my eyes, but the siren stayed. The silence stayed. The look in Dad's eyes stayed. It wasn't rage. It wasn't even disappointment. It was the grief of knowing his son now carried the same weight he tried so hard to lift. They'll say this isn't about race, that it was just a misunderstanding. But misunderstandings don't bring cops. They don't start with locked stairs and end with suspended schooling. Misunderstandings get cleared up. This was something else. This was legacy. This was history pressing its palm against my chest, whispering, "We've been here before. And now, so have I. So tomorrow, I'll lace up. I'll shoot on that bent rim. I'll keep my eyes up, because shrinking isn't the answer. And silence doesn't mean surrender. But I won't forget. Not the look in her eyes. Not the sound of my own voice. Steady even when my hands shook. Not the way Dad stood beside me like a wall no one could knock down. And not the question I still carry. Why does the world see a weapon when I carry a wallet? I may be Big Shaq's son, but I'm also the boy they didn't see. And I won't let them forget me now. The idea didn't come to Shaq in anger. It didn't rise from rage or revenge. And it wasn't born in the echo of the slurs whispered behind closed doors. It came late one night, long after Jalen had fallen asleep, when the house was quiet and the ache in Shaq's chest felt heavier than his own body. He'd been staring at the old rec center proposal, owed across his desk, the one Ray Griggs tried to kill with politics and bitterness. He flipped through every page, every signature, every stamped denial turned green-lit approval, and realized something. The fight was never meant to be one-sided. You don't heal a town by punishing one person. You heal it by showing it what it's been breathing, in calling fresh air. So Shaq called a meeting. Not behind closed doors. Not in a conference room. He booked the high school auditorium, the same one Jalen had stood in for his first debate meet. The same stage where neighbors clapped politely for scholarship kids, while whispering about which ones deserved it. It seated 400. They would fill every seat. Flyers went up around town. No catchy headlines. Just a message in plain font, plain voice. Community Accountability Night, hosted by Shaquille O'Neal. All are welcome. All truths on the table. There was no mention of Cynthia, no call-out, no agenda beyond a promise that the truth would be addressed, and the floor would be open. Some called it a stunt. Others said it was long overdue. Either way, by the time the first car pulled into the lot, people were already whispering theories. Shaq walked into the building, an hour before the start. No entourage, no camera crews, just him in a worn black notebook, tucked under his arm. Inside it were names, dates, statements, receipts, not from stores, but from a system that kept stamping the same stories onto different kids. He didn't wear a suit, just jeans and a navy shirt. His size, his presence, it all filled the stage before he ever opened his mouth. When he stepped to the podium, people fell silent, not out of fear, but respect and curiosity, because no one knew what was coming. "I want to thank y'all for being here," he began, voice steady. "This ain't gonna be easy, but the truth usually ain't." He paused, eyes sweeping the crowd. He saw his old coach, a few school board members, the barber who gave Jalen his first fade, a group of teens in the back with crossed arms and skeptical faces, and then third row, aisle seat, Cynthia Griggs. She sat alone, back straight, lips tight, like someone bracing for either a wave or a confession. Shaq continued. "You all know what happened last week. My son, Jalen, walked into a store, money in hand, and walked out with the police on his heels. We've seen it before, haven't we? In other towns, on other screens, we shake our heads, post a hashtag, move on. But this time, it wasn't some distant name. It was my son. It was your neighbor." The auditorium was still. I could have called for boycotts, could have lawyered up, could have burned it all down in the court of public opinion. But that's not what heals. What heals is exposing what's under the surface. The patterns, the policies, the silence. He opened his notebook. "Did you know that since 2017, Crestwood Pines has had 16 police calls made from local businesses describing suspicious young men who turned out to be unarmed, innocent, and underage? 13 of them were Black or Hispanic. Only 2 of those incidents were followed by a written apology. None led to disciplinary action. A murmur moved through the seats. Shaq kept going. I'm not here to roast Miss Griggs. I'm not here to cancel anybody. But I am here to name what's real. What happened to my son was not isolated. It was allowed, by precedent, by protection, by this town's comfort with being uncomfortable only when it's too late. He closed the notebook. And so, tonight, I've asked Miss Griggs to speak. Not because I expect her to change everything, but because she's not the only one who has to. All eyes turned. Cynthia stood slowly. No applause. No boos. Just the tension of 100 people watching a dam consider breaking. She stepped toward the mic, heels clicking like punctuation. She wore a plain blouse. No jewelry. Just the weight of the moment, clinging to her like humidity. She adjusted the mic. I didn't come here to defend myself, she began. Her voice cracked, and she cleared it. I came here because something in me broke when I saw him walk out of that store and realized I hadn't seen him at all. She took a breath. I called the police because I felt something I didn't question. I didn't ask myself why I was afraid. I just responded. And that's the problem, isn't it? People didn't move. Some blinked slowly. Others sat with their arms still crossed. My late husband Ray and I. We fought that community center. We said it was about zoning and noise and business. But the truth? She looked out at the crowd. We were afraid. Afraid of change. Afraid of losing control. And in that fear, we hurt people. I let his bitterness become mine. Another breath. I saw that boy's last name, and I saw a ghost. Not a child. Not a customer. Just a shadow from a past I refuse to admit I helped create. That's on me. She turned toward Shaq. I'm sorry. Not just to you, but to Jalen. And to every kid who's ever walked into my store and felt unwelcome because of how I was looking at them. A pause. Then she stepped back, face unreadable. The silence was long, until someone in the back clapped. Then another, and slowly the auditorium filled with reluctant applause. Not for redemption, but for the moment truth didn't flinch. Shaq returned to the mic. We don't heal by pretending it didn't happen, he said. We heal by saying it out loud. And then doing something different. That night, a sign went up outside Griggs Hardware. Not from protesters. From Cynthia herself. It read, under new reflection. We're listening. We're changing. It wasn't a solution. But it was a start. And in a town where silence once echoed loudest, the truth finally had a microphone. The rim squeaked when the ball kissed it. That sweet metal clink echoing across the backyard like a bell. Not the sharp clang of a missed shot. Not the hollow knock of a backboard under pressure. Just a soft, centered ring. Jalen grinned, bent his knees, and caught the ball, as it bounced back to him. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. Shaq stood a few feet behind him, hands on hips, sweat darkening the collar of his t-shirt. The sun had dipped just far enough to cast long shadows across the cracked concrete, streaks of light carving golden lines between the two of them. The backyard was quiet, save for the rhythm of the bounce, the squeak of sneakers, and the breath shared between father and son. This was their place now. Not the headlines, not the school, not the courtroom of public opinion, or the memory of a hardware store. Just the court they'd patched up with their own hands, the one they said they'd finished together. And today, finally, they had the new net, the one Jalen had tried to buy before everything fell apart, now hung above them, clean, white, and strong. Shaq had installed it without saying much, letting Jalen hand him bolts and tools in silence. Every twist of the wrench, every tap of the hammer had felt like a stitch, sewing back the gap that had formed between them. They didn't talk about the forum. Not yet. Didn't mention the applause or Cynthia's voice cracking at the mic, or the slow, cautious way the town had started nodding again, instead of looking away. It wasn't that it didn't matter. It was just that out here, under the open sky, some things didn't need retelling. Shaq watched as Jalen stepped back to the three-point line, took a breath and let another shot fly. It arced high and smooth, kissed the net clean, and dropped. That's what I'm talking about, Shaq said, the grin finally pushing through. Jalen looked over his shoulder, eyes gleaming. You weren't even guarding me. Shaq picked up the second ball and bounced it hard. You want defense, I'll give you defense. And for a few minutes, that's all it was.
Laughter, bumping elbows, lazy smack talk.
A full game of one-on-one that neither kept score of. It wasn't about winning, not anymore. It was about the fact that they were still here together. Whole, changed, but unbroken. When they finally stopped, winded and soaked with sun, Jalen flopped down onto the grass, arms sprawled wide. Shaq joined him a moment later, the earth solid beneath their backs. The sky above them had turned the color of bruised peaches, deep orange and soft lavender. Feels different now, Jalen said, his voice barely louder than the rustling trees. What does? Shaq asked. Everything. This place. The net. Me. Shaq looked over. That's not a bad thing. No, Jalen said. Not bad. Just bigger. I thought I was just gonna play a game that day. You know? Surprise you. Make you smile. But now I see it. That wasn't just a store. That wasn't just a net. That was the world looking at me. And me looking back. Shaq nodded slowly. He didn't interrupt. I used to think your name was a shield, Jalen continued. But it's not. It's a torch. It doesn't block the fire. It just shows me where it's coming from. Shaq sat up then, elbows on knees, eyes on the court. You're not wrong. My name don't protect you. Not from everything. Maybe not even from most things. But what it can do, what we can do, is carry something bigger than the weight they try to put on us. He paused, choosing his next words carefully. You carried yourself through that mess, through the noise, the looks, the suspension. You didn't swing. You didn't shout. You stood there straight. That's strength they can't teach in schools, son. That's the kind they try to take early, before you know you got it. Jalen looked at him then, not as a boy looking up to a giant, but as a young man seeing the same reflection, older, warier, but carved from the same truth. Does it ever stop? He asked. Shaq shook his head. No. But it shifts. The more you carry, the stronger you get. And one day someone else will see you standing, and they'll remember how to do it too. A breeze cut through the court, lifting the edge of a loose page taped to the back door. Jalen's handwritten quote from Baldwin. Not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it is faced. They both watched it flutter, then fall still. Shaq stood and offered a hand. Jalen took it, pulling himself to his feet. They didn't say much else, just picked up the balls, tossed them in the bin, and walked back toward the house as the last sliver of light dipped behind the trees. At the porch, Jalen paused. I'm gonna keep playing, he said. I don't care if the world watches or turns away. I'm not shrinking. Shaq smiled. I know. That's why I trust you out there. Jalen stepped inside. Shaq lingered a moment longer, looking back at the court, the rim, the way the net moved gently in the breeze, like it remembered every shot from that evening. He breathed deep, feeling not just pride, but peace. Not because the world was fixed. It wasn't. Not because justice had arrived in some perfect final form. It hadn't. But because somewhere in all of this, between the headlines and the heartbreak, the accusations and the answers, his son had found his footing. And that footing was firm. Shaq picked up the notebook he'd left on the porch, flipped to the last page. He didn't write anything new. He just looked at the space he'd saved there, and let it be. Some truths didn't need ink to stay permanent. Then he stepped inside and closed the door. And in that quiet, one last thought settled in his chest, steady and full. They tried to shrink him. But my son, he's taller than all of it. If this story unsettled something in you, don't look away. Ask what you'd do if that was your son, your name, your town. The mirror's been held up. Now the question is, what do you see? Because silence didn't protect Jalen, and silence won't change what's coming next.